It was a quiet afternoon in the heart of the city, but inside the courtroom, tension filled the air like a heavy fog. The case had been going on for weeks, and everyone was eagerly waiting for the final twist. The defense attorney, Sarah Mitchell, stood confidently, her eyes fixed on the jury, while the prosecutor, Robert Hayes, paced back and forth, preparing for what seemed like the final battle. But no one could have predicted the bombshell Sarah was about to drop, one that would change everything. The courtroom was filled with spectators, reporters scribbling furiously in their notepads, and the judge, who had seen countless cases in his career, looking particularly serious that day. The defendant, a man named Daniel Green, sat nervously in the dock, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly. His eyes flickered to the clock on the wall, the seconds ticking away. Daniel had been accused of a crime so terrible, so unforgivable, that his fate seemed sealed. But Sarah believed in his innocence. She believed in something more. She believed in the truth that no one else had the courage to pursue. As the defense attorney stepped forward, her voice calm yet strong, she made her opening statement. But it wasn't the usual speech about evidence or witnesses. No, this time, it was different. Sarah spoke of something that had never come up before, the secret that had been buried for years. The key to this case, she said, does not lie in the accusations against my client. It lies in the truth hidden in the past, a truth that someone here today is desperately trying to keep from being exposed. The courtroom fell silent. Every head turned to look at her. The prosecutor's face turned red, and he shot her a sharp look, but Sarah wasn't backing down. The air was thick with suspense as she hinted at a conspiracy, a cover-up that involved more people than just Daniel. As the crowd whispered in disbelief, Sarah took a deep breath and continued. Someone in this room knows exactly what happened that night, and they've been hiding the truth ever since. Daniel, sitting in the dock, swallowed hard. Could it be? Could the key to his freedom be within reach? But just as the suspense was at its peak, the judge intervened, calling for a brief recess. The room buzzed with conversations, people exchanging theories and whispers, but no one had any answers, yet. As the camera zooms in on Daniel's face, we can see the fear, the hope, and the uncertainty all mixed together. What will happen next? Will Sarah be able to uncover the truth, or has the conspiracy gone too deep? With so much at stake, the next moments could change everything. But the story is far from over. This is only the beginning. Stay tuned to find out what happens next, as the courtroom drama unfolds. The real question is, who will walk away with the truth, and who will be left to face the consequences? The courtroom buzzed with whispered speculations as Sarah Mitchell returned to her desk, her confident stride masking the storm brewing in her mind. While she arranged her notes, her eyes flickered toward Robert Hayes, who sat across the room, his expression unreadable. He was a seasoned prosecutor with a reputation for dismantling defense arguments with surgical precision. Sarah knew he wasn't just another opponent. He was someone who could turn the tide of the trial with a single, well-timed argument. Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that Hayes knew something he wasn't saying, a secret he was guarding fiercely. As the recess ended and the judge re-entered the room, the atmosphere shifted. Sarah rose to her feet, her hand steady as she adjusted her blazer. "Your Honor," she began, her voice carrying a tone of resolve that demanded attention. "Before we proceed, I would like to request that we call an additional witness to the stand. This individual holds critical information about the night in question, information that will shed light on the inconsistencies in the prosecution's case." Hayes immediately stood, his objection quick and sharp. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. The defense cannot spring a surprise witness without prior notice." The judge, his face lined with years of experience, looked from Sarah to Hayes and back again. "Ms. Mitchell, do you have a valid explanation for this last-minute request?" Sarah nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Yes, Your Honor." The witness's testimony only recently came to light during my ongoing investigation. Their account could directly impact the jury's understanding of what truly happened. The judge paused, his expression thoughtful, before giving a curt nod. "Proceed, but tread carefully, counselor." As the name of the witness was announced, a collective gasp rippled through the courtroom. A middle-aged man in a wrinkled suit stepped hesitantly toward the stand, his face pale and his hands clutching the edges of his jacket. His name was Leonard Graves, a private investigator whose reputation was as murky as the shadows he often worked in. Leonard's involvement in the case was unexpected, to say the least, and the murmurs from the gallery hinted at the audience's intrigue. Sarah approached the stand, her voice steady but probing. "Mr. Graves, could you please tell the court where you were on the night of July 15th, the night in question?" Leonard hesitated, his eyes darting toward Hayes for a split second before he spoke. "I was hired to follow someone." The room erupted into murmurs again, prompting the judge to rap his gavel. "Order in the court." Sarah pressed on, her tone relentless. "And who, Mr. Graves, hired you for this task?" Leonard swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "I can't say." But Sarah wasn't letting him off the hook that easily. She leaned closer, her words sharp as a blade. "Mr. Graves, if you withhold information, you may be held in contempt of court. I urge you to reconsider." The tension in the room was palpable. All eyes were on Leonard as he looked down at his trembling hands. Whatever he was about to say had the power to unravel the prosecution's case, or perhaps to create an entirely new layer of mystery. Leonard's voice quivered as he shifted uncomfortably in the witness chair, the weight of the courtroom's gaze pressing down on him. His eyes darted back and forth, as though searching for a way out, but Sarah was unyielding. She leaned in, her expression soft but firm, urging him to continue. "Mr. Graves," she said, "the court is here to find the truth. If you have information that could change the course of this trial, now is the time to speak." There was a long pause. Leonard seemed to shrink into himself, the sweat beading on his forehead as he wrestled with the decision. Finally, he exhaled deeply, his voice barely a whisper. I was hired by someone close to the victim. Someone who didn't want their involvement in this case to come to light. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. This was the moment. This could be the turning point. She glanced over at Daniel, who was sitting motionless in the defendant's chair, his face drawn with a mixture of fear and confusion. What did Leonard mean by someone close to the victim? Was this the breakthrough she had been hoping for, or was she walking into another trap? Prosecutor Hayes immediately stood, his voice cutting through the tension. "Objection, Your Honor. This is nothing more than speculation. We need concrete evidence, not vague accusations." The judge looked sternly at Hayes. Sustained. "Mr. Graves, please clarify your statement." Leonard's hands shook as he fumbled with the papers in front of him. I can't give you a name," he stammered, "but I can tell you that they were involved. They didn't want the truth to come out because it would ruin everything. Their career, their reputation." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was bigger, much bigger. Someone with power, someone who could manipulate the system, was behind this. She could feel the pieces of the puzzle shifting, but the image wasn't clear yet. Who was trying to cover up the truth, and why? Across the room, Robert Hayes' gaze hardened. His fingers drummed nervously on the table, and Sarah could see the flicker of unease in his eyes. Was he part of this? Was his deep investment in the case just a way to hide something even more sinister? The tension between them had always been palpable, but now it was more than just professional rivalry. It was personal. The judge cleared his throat, bringing the room back to focus. "Mr. Graves, do you have any proof of your claims? Any evidence to back up these assertions?" Leonard hesitated. "No," he admitted, "but I have a lead. I was going to meet with someone who knows more about this, but they never showed up. And now I'm worried for my safety." The room went still. Sarah could feel the weight of the words hanging in the air. A lead. Someone had information, but they were missing. This was more than just a courtroom battle. It was a game of high stakes, one that could cost someone everything. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to steady her thoughts. She needed to keep the pressure on, but she also needed to play her cards carefully. "Mr. Graves," she said, her voice measured, "if your life is in danger, I suggest you tell us everything you know. We can offer protection." Before she could finish, Hayes was on his feet again, cutting her off. "Your Honor, this is absurd. This man is clearly trying to manipulate the court with threats and half-baked stories." Sarah's eyes narrowed as she locked gazes with Hayes. "Is it manipulation, Mr. Hayes? Or is it the truth finally coming to light?" The judge rapped his gavel, silencing both of them. "Enough. Mr. Graves, you will return to your statement. Tell us who hired you, or we will have no choice but to dismiss your testimony as irrelevant." But Leonard was already shaking his head, tears welling up in his eyes. I can't do it. They'll kill me if I do." A ripple of shock ran through the courtroom. The words hung in the air like an unspoken threat, and everyone present felt the weight of it. Leonard's fear was palpable. Was someone really trying to silence him? And if so, why? What had he stumbled upon that was so dangerous? The judge looked at the defense and the prosecution, his face grim. "This court will adjourn for the day. Mr. Graves, you are dismissed for now. We will reconvene tomorrow to discuss the next steps." As the gavel fell, Sarah could feel the undercurrent of something much darker moving beneath the surface. She caught Daniel's eye once more, but this time there was something different in his gaze. Hope. But it was fleeting, like a distant memory that could never be fully grasped. They were still so far from the truth, and time was running out. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood for a moment, letting the cool breeze wash over her, but the unease in her gut wouldn't subside. She had a feeling that everything was connected, that Leonard's testimony, the missing lead, and the mysterious figures lurking behind the scenes all pointed toward something bigger, something that had been hidden for far too long. But who could she trust? The walls were closing in, and every move she made felt like it was being watched. The stakes had never been higher, and the tension was only building. One wrong step, and they could all be caught in a game they didn't understand. The following day, the courtroom felt heavier than ever. Sarah entered, her mind racing with the realization that every step she took was inching them closer to the truth, or to a complete disaster. Leonard's cryptic testimony had set the stage for something far more dangerous than she had anticipated. She could sense it now, the quiet hum of tension in the air, as if everyone in the room was holding their breath, waiting for the next move. But no one knew what that next move would be, not even Sarah. She sat at the defense table, her eyes flicking to Daniel, whose face had grown more withdrawn with each passing day. He had once been confident, convinced that the truth would eventually set him free. But now, with every new revelation, his hope seemed to fray a little more. And she couldn't blame him. The deeper they went, the murkier everything became. Robert Hayes was no longer the sharp, calculated prosecutor she had come to expect. He looked rattled, his usual composure slipping just enough for Sarah to notice. Was it guilt? Fear? Or had he somehow become entangled in something much larger than the case at hand? She couldn't afford to waste time trying to read him. Every moment felt like it could be their last chance to expose what had been hidden. The judge entered, and the usual formalities began. But as the proceedings unfolded, Sarah could feel the pressure mounting. Leonard had promised to bring forward more evidence, more information, but he was nowhere to be found. His testimony had been abruptly cut off the day before, and now his silence was deafening. The clock on the wall ticked louder than ever, as if mocking the slow crawl of time that was slipping away from them. It was then that Sarah received the call. She stepped out of the courtroom, her heart racing. The voice on the other end of the line was strained, barely audible over the static. "Ms. Mitchell, you need to get to him. Now." It was Leonard. She didn't need to ask questions. She knew what it meant. He had tried to reach out to someone who could help him. But now, he was in danger. It was clear that someone was pulling the strings behind the scenes, someone who had the power to silence anyone who got too close. She hung up the phone and glanced back at the courtroom door. Every instinct screamed at her to stay, to fight for Daniel's innocence, but she couldn't ignore the urgency of Leonard's words. They needed to find him. Now. Without him, they had nothing. She grabbed her things and rushed toward the exit, her mind already racing with the implications. What if Leonard was already too late? What if the very people trying to keep the truth hidden had already made their move? The city outside the courthouse was buzzing with the usual activity, but Sarah felt disconnected from it all. She hailed a cab, her mind focused entirely on one thing: Leonard's safety. The cab driver's casual chatter barely registered as she watched the streets pass by in a blur. The address Leonard had given her was in an industrial district, a place Sarah had never heard of, surrounded by abandoned buildings and empty warehouses. It felt like a ghost town. When the cab pulled up to the location, Sarah's pulse quickened. The area was dark, deserted, save for a single flickering street lamp. She paid the driver quickly and stepped out into the cool night air, her breath coming in shallow bursts. Every instinct told her to turn back, to call for backup, but she couldn't afford to wait. Leonard's life was on the line, and so was everything they had worked for. She moved cautiously, her steps muffled by the damp ground. The buildings around her loomed like silent sentinels, their windows dark, their doors locked tight. She reached the address Leonard had given her, a nondescript warehouse at the end of the alley. The door was slightly ajar. She hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open, the creak of the metal hinges echoing in the empty space. Inside, the dim light from a single bulb barely illuminated the room. Boxes and old equipment were stacked haphazardly around the perimeter, but there was no sign of Leonard. "Mr. Graves," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. No response. Her eyes scanned the room, her senses on high alert. She stepped further inside, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. There was something off about this place, something she couldn't quite place. The air felt thick, almost suffocating. She moved cautiously, her heart hammering in her chest. And then she heard it. A faint sound, barely perceptible, a scuffle, a muffled cry. Without thinking, she sprinted toward the source of the noise. The room opened up into a small, dimly lit office. The scene that greeted her made her freeze in her tracks. Leonard was lying on the floor, blood trickling from a wound on his head. His eyes were open but glazed over, staring into nothingness. A shadowy figure stood above him, their face obscured by a hood, holding a blood-stained crowbar. Before Sarah could react, the figure turned, their eyes meeting hers. Time seemed to slow, the weight of the moment pressing down on her. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. She could only watch as the figure's lips curled into a menacing smile. Then, the door slammed shut behind her, and everything went black. Sarah's world spun wildly as she tried to regain her bearings. Her head throbbed, a sharp pain cutting through the fog that clouded her thoughts. She could feel the weight of the darkness pressing in on her, suffocating her. For a moment, she couldn't tell if her eyes were open or closed. The metallic scent of blood hung in the air, and there was a faint echo of a voice, low and menacing, but the words were too distorted to understand. Her pulse quickened as the panic set in. She had to focus. Leonard's life was still in danger, and she couldn't afford to lose herself in the terror of the moment. With a grim effort, she shook her head, trying to clear the haze. The last thing she remembered was the shadowy figure standing over Leonard, and then darkness. Suddenly, she heard movement, footsteps, slow and deliberate. She tensed, bracing for whatever was coming next, but it wasn't the figure with the crowbar. A new presence. Her eyes fluttered open just enough to make out the silhouette of someone standing above her. "Sarah Mitchell," the voice said, smooth but cold, like the chill of the grave. "You're a long way from the courtroom." Her heart skipped. The voice. She recognized it instantly. Robert Hayes. Her breath caught in her throat. Why was he here? And why now, in this abandoned warehouse, at the moment when everything seemed to spiral out of control? He had been the prosecutor, the man who had fought so fiercely against her in court. But now he was here, standing over her, as if the line between law and crime had been utterly blurred. You're the one who sent Leonard to the stand," Sarah murmured, though her voice barely rose above a whisper. She couldn't keep the shock from her voice. The pieces didn't fit. Robert Hayes was no longer just the enemy. He was something much darker. But how? Hayes crouched down beside her, his face now visible, though it was hard to make out in the dim light. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, but there was nothing warm about it. "You're getting closer, Sarah," he said softly. "But you're too late. Leonard's already given us everything we need. You really thought you were going to walk out of here with the truth? That was never your prize." Sarah's mind raced. Leonard had been more than a witness. He had been a pawn in someone's twisted game. But who was pulling the strings? Why was Hayes involved in all of this? Before she could formulate another question, a new voice cut through the tension. "Leave her be, Robert." The figure who stepped into view was tall, cloaked in shadow, and yet unmistakably familiar. Sarah's heart sank as she saw him. It was Daniel. Daniel Green. Her breath caught in her throat. Was he part of this too? Had he been manipulating the entire situation from the beginning? She thought she was fighting for his freedom, but in that moment, it felt like she was staring at the puppet master. Her mind screamed for clarity, but the confusion was too overwhelming. "I didn't want you to know this way," Daniel said, his voice distant, almost mechanical. "But you had to. You were getting too close. Too many people were starting to ask questions. People with the power to make things disappear." The words hit her like a blow to the chest. She had trusted Daniel, believed in his innocence. But now, standing before her, he looked nothing like the man she had defended. His eyes were colder, more calculating. It was as if the man who had once pleaded for justice had disappeared, leaving only a shadow of the person she had fought for. "Why?" she whispered, her voice trembling. Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he glanced at Hayes, as if seeking approval. Hayes, for his part, simply nodded, his expression unreadable. Daniel finally turned his gaze back to Sarah. "Because I never intended to let the truth come out. Not the way you think. The truth. is more dangerous than you realize." The words echoed in her mind. The truth was dangerous. But why? What had they been hiding? What had she been so close to uncovering? Suddenly, a loud crash interrupted their conversation. A distant sound, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps, fast and heavy, coming toward them. Daniel's eyes snapped to the door, his face paling as the sound grew louder. "They're here," he muttered, his voice tight with urgency. "Who?" Sarah demanded, struggling to push herself into a sitting position despite the pain in her head. Daniel's eyes darted toward her. "The ones who don't want you to find out what happened. The ones who've been watching this entire case." And before Sarah could ask any more questions, the door to the warehouse slammed open, revealing two men in dark suits, their faces obscured by the shadows. They moved with a speed and precision that spoke of military training, their presence like an impending storm. Daniel stepped back, his face hardening. "This was never supposed to happen, Sarah. But you've forced my hand." The men in suits stepped forward, their eyes locked on Sarah with a chilling intensity. The weight of the moment crashed down on her, and for the first time, she felt the full weight of what she had uncovered. It wasn't just a case about a man's innocence. It was about something far deeper, something with the power to ruin lives, tear apart families, and destroy everything in its path. One of the men reached into his jacket, pulling out a small, unmarked envelope. He handed it to Daniel without a word. Daniel didn't open it immediately. His eyes locked onto Sarah's with an unsettling calmness. "It's over, Sarah," Daniel said softly, almost sadly. "You've been chasing a ghost. And now, it's time to let go." And as Sarah sat there, bound by her own confusion and fear, she realized that the truth she had fought for was slipping further from her grasp. The stakes had grown far higher than she could have ever imagined. Whoever was behind this would stop at nothing to ensure that the past stayed buried. The game had shifted, and the clock was ticking faster than ever. What had she truly uncovered? And who would be left standing once the truth came crashing down? The warehouse was silent except for the muffled shuffle of footsteps and the faint hum of the flickering overhead lights. Sarah's heart raced as the men in suits closed in on her, their eyes cold and determined. She could feel the weight of the envelope Daniel had just received pressing on her chest, as if it held the key to everything she had been trying to uncover. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive, and the finality of the moment was almost suffocating. Daniel stood a few steps away, his posture rigid, as if preparing for something far worse than what Sarah could possibly imagine. His eyes darted from the men in suits to her, and she saw for the first time a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, a crack in the armor he had built around himself. He wasn't entirely in control of this situation, and that realization sent a shockwave of clarity through her. But it was too late for any questions or explanations now. The storm was coming, and it was going to hit hard. One of the suited men stepped forward, holding a gun in his hand. His movements were precise, like a surgeon preparing for an operation. "You've been digging too deep, Miss Mitchell," the man said, his voice low but steady. "You should have stopped when you had the chance." Sarah's mind was racing, trying to piece together everything she had learned, everything that had led her to this moment. She could feel the truth just within reach, close enough to taste. But what was the truth, exactly? Who was behind this? And why was Daniel so involved? Before she could react, Daniel's voice cut through the tension. "Let her go," he said, his voice surprisingly calm, even though she could see the tension in his body. This wasn't supposed to go this far. The suited men froze, their eyes narrowing. One of them gave a slight nod, signaling to the other. Daniel stepped forward, standing between Sarah and the men. "You don't understand," he continued, his voice tinged with something close to regret. It wasn't just about the case. It was about control, about power. And now you're all caught up in it. All of you. You just don't know who you're really up against. The men's expressions flickered, their confidence faltering for a brief moment. The silence that followed felt like a vacuum, sucking the air from the room. Then, with an almost imperceptible movement, Daniel took a step back, his hand slipping into his coat pocket. It was too quick to react to, and before Sarah could even think to stop him, a sharp crack split the air. The suited man who had been closest to Sarah collapsed to the ground, a look of surprise frozen on his face. The gun he had been holding clattered to the floor. The second man, visibly shaken, turned toward Daniel, his hand reaching for his own weapon, but he never got the chance. In a blur of motion, Daniel's hand shot out, grabbing the envelope from his pocket and tossing it across the room to Sarah. "Open it," he commanded, his voice urgent. "It's not over yet." For a heartbeat, Sarah hesitated. She could feel the weight of the envelope in her hands, but it wasn't the weight of paper. It was the weight of everything she had fought for, everything she had risked. She ripped it open without a second thought. Inside, she found a flash drive. "Everything you need is on there," Daniel said, his voice softer now. "The truth. All of it. About me, about them. About what happened to the victim." Her mind whirled as she connected the dots. The victim, the conspiracy, Leonard's involvement, and now Daniel. He was playing a game on a much bigger scale than she had ever imagined. He had manipulated the entire case to make sure that no one uncovered the truth about what was really going on. He had been part of a covert operation from the beginning, using his own trial as a distraction while keeping his true enemies in the shadows. But just as Sarah was about to say something, to confront him with everything she had learned, the door behind them slammed open once again. The sound of a second group of footsteps echoed in the space, and Sarah's blood ran cold. She turned just in time to see a second pair of suited men enter the room, their faces impassive, carrying a different kind of weapon. Not guns, but briefcases. They looked just as professional, just as organized, and just as dangerous. The first set of men on the floor, incapacitated and unconscious, were no longer a concern. It was these new arrivals who commanded the room. One of the men spoke. "Mr. Green, I believe you have what we need." His tone was calm, almost respectful, as if this entire situation was nothing but business. "I trust you'll cooperate. We can make things very easy for you." Sarah's mind reeled. What was happening? Had Daniel been playing them all along? Had he been working with these new men from the start? The reality was more twisted than she had ever anticipated. The whole trial, the investigation, even Leonard's disappearance, it had all been orchestrated to keep her in the dark while the real players moved behind the scenes. Daniel turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "It's time to make a choice, Sarah. You can take the flash drive and expose everything, but there's a cost. People will die for it. More than you know. Or you can walk away. And let us handle it our way." The final twist hit Sarah with the force of a freight train. As she glanced between Daniel, the men with the briefcases, and the still form of Leonard on the ground, she realized that the battle for the truth wasn't just about winning or losing in the courtroom. It was about survival. There was no more right or wrong, just power. She made her decision. But the question remained, who would pay the price for the truth? And how far was she willing to go to make sure it came to light? Sarah stood frozen, her mind racing as Daniel's words hung heavy in the air. The choice was excruciating. Take the flash drive and risk it all, or walk away and let everything stay buried. She knew the stakes. Exposing the truth would mean bringing down powerful people who had orchestrated the entire mess. But it would also mean that the victim, whose death had sparked this entire case, would finally have justice. Daniel's cold gaze never left her, his expression unreadable. The men in suits stood silent behind him, their presence more oppressive than ever. Sarah felt the weight of the moment settle into her chest, but there was a flicker of resolve within her. The world wasn't black and white. She had learned that over the course of this trial. But sometimes the truth had to be brought to light, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, Sarah made her decision. She reached for the flash drive and tucked it safely into her pocket, her hands trembling but steady. She looked at Daniel, her voice calm but firm. "I'll make sure the truth comes out," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "But not because you want me to. Not because it's your game. Because it's what's right." For a moment, Daniel didn't speak, his eyes narrowing slightly. Then, with a slow nod, he stepped back. The men with the briefcases moved forward, their faces impassive, but Sarah could see the hesitation in their eyes. They weren't expecting her to make this choice. In fact, it seemed like they were waiting for something, a signal, perhaps, or a confrontation. But nothing came. Without another word, Daniel turned toward the exit. The men in suits followed him, their footsteps echoing in the empty warehouse. The tension in the room started to lift, but Sarah knew this was far from over. She had made her move, but the battle was far from finished. As they disappeared into the shadows, Sarah turned to look at Leonard's body on the floor. It was clear he had known more than he ever let on. He had been part of the puzzle, but his involvement hadn't been as clean-cut as she had hoped. His last-minute attempts to steer her toward the truth had only served to complicate things further. He had been both a victim and a pawn, caught in a game much larger than he had realized. But now, it was up to her. She wasn't going to let Leonard's death be in vain. She wasn't going to let the lies continue to spread unchecked. In the days that followed, Sarah worked tirelessly, using the flash drive as a tool to expose the hidden truths of the case. The documents, the evidence, and the damning files on that drive were enough to unravel the conspiracy that had kept so many in power. It wasn't an easy battle, and it wasn't a clean one, but Sarah knew she had made the right choice. She had taken the first step toward bringing those responsible to justice. Daniel's true involvement in the entire case would eventually come to light, though it was clear that he had a much bigger role to play in a world of corruption and power games. The trial, once thought to be about a single man's innocence, had now opened up a much darker chapter. And as Sarah sat in her office one night, watching the city lights flicker beneath her, she realized that her fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The truth was a powerful weapon, but it came with its own dangers. She had seen firsthand how far some would go to protect their secrets. But she had also learned the importance of standing up for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the case concluded, and the legal system slowly began to address the deep-rooted corruption Sarah had uncovered, she knew one thing for certain: she had made a difference. It wasn't just about winning the case or getting a guilty verdict. It was about revealing the truth, no matter how dark or difficult it might be. And in the end, that was the only victory that truly mattered.